Most people spend half their life trying to become rich without ever understanding what rich people are actually paid for. That is one of the strangest things I have ever watched. They work, they save, they worry, they budget, they compare, they chase credentials, they sit in traffic, they argue with numbers, they ask for raises, they sit through meetings that drain the soul out of a room. And at the end of all that effort, many of them still do not know the one fact that would have changed the way they organize their whole adult life. Wealth does not come from effort alone. It comes from ownership. That sentence sounds almost too simple to deserve your attention. It deserves all of it. Because once you understand it, 1,000 confusing things about money suddenly become clear. You understand why one person works less and earns more. You understand why founders can look absurdly rich compared with talented employees. You understand why the man who bought a great business 20 years ago can sleep through recessions while the man who earns a fine salary still wakes up tense on Monday. You understand why some people seem to accelerate financially even after they stop increasing their labor. And you understand why so many hardworking people never get there, even though nobody could accuse them of being lazy. They are not lazy. They are simply operating inside the wrong formula. The world tells ordinary people that income is the finish line. That is the first lie. Income matters, of course. It matters enormously. But income is not the finish line. Income is the fuel line. If you mistake fuel for the destination, you can spend your whole life earning more and never truly escaping. This is why I tell people that when you boil the subject down, there are really only 3 durable ways to become wealthy. In the serious sense of the word, you build the machine, you buy the machine, or you join the machine, get paid well inside it, and then convert that income into ownership. That is the whole thing. Most people keep waiting for a fourth door. There is no fourth door. There are a million decorations people put around the 3 doors, different industries, different labels, different tax wrappers, different stories, different personalities. But the economic engine underneath is always the same. Build it, buy it, or enter it and convert your labor into a claim on productive assets. Now, I want to take these one by one because people hear them too abstractly at first. They nod. Then they go right back to living as if the answer were hidden somewhere else. It is not hidden. It is only emotionally inconvenient. The first path is to build the machine. This is the most obvious path and the one most people romanticize very badly. They think building is about passion. It is not. Passion helps you endure. Passion is not the economic engine. The engine is ownership of a system that can produce value at scale. That is what matters. A man who opens a small shop and must personally unlock the door, handle every customer complaint, approve every invoice, and fight every payroll problem, has not necessarily built a wealth machine. He may have built himself a stressful job wearing the costume of ownership. That is different. What creates wealth is not merely creating a business. It is creating something that can detach from your immediate personal labor, standardize its output, reach beyond your own hours, and remain yours in sufficient size while it scales. That is why founders can become rich in a way salaried people rarely do. It is not because founders are morally superior. It is not because they work harder in some permanent universal sense. Many employees work just as hard and often harder in any given week. The difference is not the sweat. The difference is the claim. If you own 60% of something that becomes worth $100 million, your share of that value has nothing to do with how many emails you answered on Tuesday. It has to do with the scale of the machine and the percentage you kept. That is a brutal but beautiful piece of capitalism. Labor is paid linearly. Ownership is repriced nonlinearly. That is why the builder's path is so powerful. But because it is powerful, people tell themselves fairy tales about it. They imagine the founder as a heroic artist following pure intuition. I have no use for that mythology. The builder's path is a structural problem, not a poetic one. You must identify unmet demand or inefficiency. You must create a product or service that can be repeated. You must build distribution. You must protect margin. You must formalize the process so that the business can work beyond your direct presence. And above all, you must keep enough equity that success still matters to you financially. That last one is where many people destroy the upside. They build something promising. Then they dilute themselves too early, too carelessly, or too weakly, or they never truly build a company at all. They build themselves a self-employed treadmill. The machine depends on them every day. So the thing never really scales into wealth. It just scales into complexity. That is not the same reward. A great many small business owners are not rich because the business is still too attached to their body. That is the difference. If you stop and the machine stops, the machine is not yet worthy of the name. Now, people often ask where the leverage is in building. They assume it is in the product. Sometimes, more often, it is in distribution. A good product with weak distribution can die quietly. An ordinary product with superior distribution can dominate a market. I have always respected distribution more than amateur dreamers do because distribution is what turns quality into cash flow. Cash flow then funds reinvestment. Reinvestment creates growth. Growth often changes valuation multiples. And once valuation starts moving on both the operating improvement and the market's changing perception of the future, the equity can reprice far faster than the founder's labor ever could. That is where the wealth appears. The public sees the outcome and says the founder became rich overnight. Nonsense. The founder became rich because he controlled a scalable asset long enough for scale and repricing to collide. That is a very different statement. It is also why the builder's path attracts extreme personalities. The upside is deeply asymmetric. You can lose years, you can lose sleep, you can lose savings, you can lose confidence, but if it works, the result can be generational. That sort of payoff distribution is not normal. A handful of extraordinary outcomes explain a great deal of the total wealth created by entrepreneurship. This is why the path is both compelling and cruel. The majority of attempts fail. The minority that work can overwhelm the arithmetic of all the failures. Now, because people love romance, they forget what makes the builder's path emotionally difficult. It is not only the uncertainty of revenue, it is the uncertainty of identity. A salary gives a person a stable story about himself. A business in the building phase does not. Some months you feel brilliant. Some months you feel fraudulent. The market does not send reassuring signals in a stable pattern. Employees may leave. Customers may delay. Suppliers may squeeze. Competitors may appear. Everything is unstable. That is why so many intelligent people prefer employment. Not because they lack talent, because they correctly perceive the emotional violence of ownership in its early phase. Ownership is the upside. Volatility is the admission fee. Not everyone is built for that fee, and it is foolish to shame people for noticing it. Still, if you are built for it, and if you want the builder's path, then understand the rule clearly. You are not trying to create a nice little operation that keeps you busy. You are trying to create a value-producing machine that can expand beyond your personal output while you retain enough ownership for expansion to change your life. Anything less is a different game. Now let us turn to the second path. You buy the machine instead of building it. This path is quieter. In the early years, it looks far less glamorous. It is also the path most compatible with ordinary people becoming wealthy. Over long periods, assuming they are disciplined enough to stay in the room. This is the investor's path. You take capital. You place it into productive assets that already exist. Then you let cash flow, retained earnings, market growth, and time do the scaling for you. That is all investing is at its most honest. You are not inventing the engine. You are buying a claim on engines that already run, a public company with durable profits, a rental property with sane economics, a private business stake, a broad index fund representing aggregate corporate earning power. Each is just a different wrapper around the same principle. Own a productive asset. Reinvest what it produces. Allow time to compound the base. That sounds straightforward. It is also psychologically brutal. That is what keeps so many people from doing it properly. The mathematics of investing are not the most difficult part. The temperament is. Take the ordinary broad equity market over long stretches. Broad equity ownership has delivered very respectable returns. Not every year, not every 5 years, but over long periods. Yes, the reason is simple. You are buying claims on businesses that sell products, hire people, allocate capital, and try to earn more tomorrow than they did yesterday. That process is productive. It is not magic. And if you reinvest the cash flows and leave the machine uninterrupted, compounding begins doing what compounding always does. The first year looks modest. The second still feels ordinary. The fifth begins to get interesting. The 10th feels much more serious. The 20th often looks like genius to people who were too impatient to endure the first 5. That is the investor's path in one sentence. The future looks slow until it looks obvious. Now, what matters here is the discipline of the sequence. First, accumulate surplus capital. Without surplus, there is no investor's path, only theory. Second, allocate it into productive assets, not junk. Not fashionable nonsense relying entirely on a greater fool, not something that produces no value and requires the existence of an even more emotional buyer later, productive assets. Third, reinvest cash flow and keep contributions steady. Fourth, repeat for a long time. And fifth, avoid catastrophic loss. That fifth part matters more than people realize. The investor's path does not usually fail because the person lacked access to the next brilliant opportunity. It fails because the person interrupted the process. He got greedy, he got frightened, he levered up, he followed the crowd into something he did not understand. He sold when the system offered him lower prices instead of seeing lower prices as a better entry point. He mistook volatility for destruction. He confused noise with information. The process is robust. The participant is fragile. That is what history shows again and again. I have never believed that great investing requires a constant stream of brilliant predictions. Mostly it requires not doing stupid things for long enough. That is a different standard and a much more useful one. You do not need to know what the market does next quarter. You need to know what kind of asset you own, what price you paid, and whether your structure allows you to keep owning it when the world becomes temporarily unpleasant. That is the investor's advantage, not foresight. Staying power. This is why I care so much about productive assets and so little about things that merely look exciting. If an asset produces nothing, if its value depends mainly on narrative and the next buyer's enthusiasm, then it can make you money temporarily, certainly, but it is not compounding wealth in the way I care about. It is speculation with different clothes. I do not confuse the two. A broad index fund qualifies because it is an ownership slice of productive enterprise. A rental property qualifies if it is actually purchased on sane economics and produces real net cash flow. A private business stake qualifies. Even a boring old dividend payer qualifies if the business is sound and the capital allocation is sensible. What does not qualify is pure consumption masquerading as investment or speculation masquerading as a durable asset. This is where people get in trouble. They want the investor's rewards without the investor's discipline. They want compounding without duration. They want upside without drawdowns. They want ownership without boredom. They want to feel brilliant more often than they want to become rich. Those people usually end up making other people rich. Now let us talk about the most important hidden ingredient in the investor's path. Time. People nod when you say time matters, then they behave as though it does not. Time is the hidden multiplier. If you invest $20,000 a year at a respectable rate of return for 30 years, you do not end up with some tidy arithmetic sum of what you put in. You end up with something far larger because growth begins producing growth of its own. That is the whole power of compounding. The early years feel underwhelming. The later years feel almost unfair. That is why the early years are so dangerous psychologically. The person looks at the account and says, "Is this all?" That is when most people sabotage themselves. The account is not supposed to feel impressive at first. It is supposed to be forming a base. Bases are boring. Towers are admired. The foolish person wants tower feelings during the base years. That is not how it works. The wise person respects what the account is becoming long before it flatters him. This is why the investor's path rewards an early start more than some heroic late sprint. Consistency beats intensity once time gets involved. Not because intensity is useless, but because time magnifies consistency in a way human beings find emotionally hard to appreciate until it is almost too late. The third path is the bridge between the first two. You join the machine, then you convert income into ownership. This is the path most people should understand much more deeply than they do, because it is the path available to ambitious ordinary people who are not founders and do not yet have enough capital to feel like natural investors. This path begins with labor, but not labor in the generic sense. Labor embedded in systems with leverage. That difference is everything. A man working very hard in a weak system may remain modestly paid forever. A man with the same talent in a system where leverage, capital, scale, and profit pools are larger can make many times more. That is why system selection matters so much. If you build a scarce skill inside a weak economic environment, the ceiling is lower. If you build a scarce skill inside technology, finance, large-scale sales, enterprise software, capital markets, energy, or other leverage, heavy systems, the economic rewards can be much greater. That is not unfairness in the childish sense. That is market structure. Compensation follows the scale of impact more than the mere amount of effort. A software engineer building a tool used by 10 million people is economically different from an equally smart person automating a tiny internal process for a local shop. An investment banker working on a billion-dollar transaction is economically different from a competent generalist running paperwork for small matters. A top enterprise salesperson whose work moves large contracts can produce value at scale that ordinary roles cannot. That is why I say the third path begins with choosing the right machine to join. But that is only the beginning. A high salary alone is not wealth. It is a bridge. If you live as though the bridge were the destination, you can end up with a very impressive income and a surprisingly weak balance sheet. This happens every day. A person breaks into a high-paying field. He is thrilled naturally. Then the money comes in and his lifestyle immediately expands to greet it. Bigger apartment, better neighborhood, more expensive car, higher status vacations. A social circle whose expectations quietly rise with his income. Soon he discovers that he has joined the right machine and is still somehow not becoming rich. Why? Because he forgot the conversion step. The third path only works if you convert labor income into ownership fast enough and consistently enough that the ownership base begins rising independently of the labor. That is the whole trick. Without that conversion, you are just a well-compensated laborer, which is fine, but it is not the same as being wealthy. This is why I care about stock compensation, profit share, carried interest, and all the other forms of economic participation that move a person closer to ownership. The bridge path becomes powerful when your labor is not paid only in wages, but partially in claims on something larger. Even then, conversion matters. A stock grant that gets sold and spent on lifestyle theater is not a wealth strategy. It is an expensive detour, a bonus that gets consumed by a bigger mortgage rather than turned into assets is not capital formation. It is income passing through your life like water through an open hand. If the bridge is to work, each surplus dollar must be asked a simple question. Will you be spent or will you become an owner? That is the line. And here is why the third path can be so powerful. Once income rises above ordinary living needs by a meaningful amount, asset accumulation accelerates in a very different way. A household investing 5 figures a year compounds differently from a household investing 6. The slope changes, and once the slope changes, time begins behaving more generously. This is why many wealthy people began not as founders, but as specialists inside high-value systems. They learned something scarce. They entered a strong industry. They got close to capital and decision making. They negotiated equity or large incentives where possible. Then they converted aggressively instead of celebrating income as though it were already victory. That path is much more common than the public likes to admit, because it is less romantic than the founder myth. The founder myth is exciting. The specialist turned owner path is quieter. Quiet paths often make a great deal of money. Now, I want to say something that most people will find irritating because irritation often attends truth. These 3 paths are straightforward, not easy, Straightforward, that distinction matters. You do not need another 1,000 theories about wealth. You need the courage to ask which of the three mechanisms you are actually living under. Are you building something scalable and keeping the equity? Are you buying productive assets and letting time work? Or are you positioning yourself inside a powerful machine and converting labor into ownership? If the honest answer is none of the above, then your financial life may be much more fragile than your paycheck suggests. That is not an insult. It is a diagnosis. Most people fail at wealth not because the mechanisms were hidden. They fail because execution requires temperament. And temperament is where adults reveal themselves. The builder fails because he cannot retain ownership, cannot build distribution, or cannot survive the volatility. The investor fails because he interrupts compounding, confuses noise with information, or seeks excitement where patience was required. The specialist fails because he upgrades lifestyle faster than he upgrades assets. That is the summary of a great many disappointments. Now let us talk about why people miss the obvious. The answer is emotion. The builder path asks for uncertainty. Most people hate uncertainty. The investor path asks for patience. Most people hate delayed visible reward. The bridge path asks for restraint. Most people hate making a lot and not displaying a lot. There is the whole problem in one sentence. The three paths to wealth are clear enough to state in minutes. The reasons people fail are emotional enough to consume decades. That is why I have always believed the hardest part of finance is not calculation. It is character. The world keeps trying to turn wealth into an information problem. If only I knew the right stock. If only I understood the next trend. If only I saw the coming sector rotation. If only I could predict policy better. That is mostly nonsense. Wealth is much more often a behavior problem. Can you stay? Can you keep ownership? Can you avoid stupid leverage? Can you not spend the surplus? Can you tolerate boredom? Can you operate in a strong system long enough for your claim on it to matter? Those are the real questions. Now, if you ask me which path is best, I will disappoint you again. There is no universal best path. The right path is the one your temperament can execute without self-sabotage. A man with founder temperament, but no investor patience, may build well and invest badly. A patient allocator with no taste for chaos may be foolish to force himself into entrepreneurship when he could quietly become rich through steady ownership. A brilliant specialist with great earnings power may waste a decade pretending he is a founder at heart while neglecting the simple brilliance of converting his surplus into productive assets. This is why self-knowledge is so important. Most people do not need more ambition. They need a more accurate understanding of which engine they are actually built to run. That accuracy can save a life. I have always admired people who knew their lane and then drove it exceptionally well. There is nothing noble about imitating the wrong route because it looks glamorous. Glamour is one of the most expensive words in the world. The public sees the builder who became a billionaire and says that is the real way, perhaps for him. The public sees the investor whose portfolio compounded quietly for decades and says that looks boring. Boring can be very rich. The public sees the high-earning specialist living in a modest house while stacking ownership and thinks he lacks style, perhaps. He may still retire 20 years before the man in the larger driveway. A serious adult learns to stop confusing visible status with hidden strength. The visible game flatters the crowd. The hidden game builds net worth. Now I want to end with something plain enough that you can use it tonight. Ask yourself 3 questions. What machine am I building? What machine do I already own? And if I am currently only labor, what portion of that labor is being converted into ownership with every passing month? If your answer to all 3 is weak, then do not blame the economy first. Do not blame the rich first. Do not blame timing first. Begin by fixing the structure. Maybe you are in the wrong system. Maybe you are spending all the surplus. Maybe you are not building anything scalable. Maybe you are investing too little, too late, too emotionally. Maybe you are trying to look successful instead of becoming strong. That happens every day. The world is full of people performing prosperity and starving future wealth. That is a very ordinary tragedy. I would rather you avoid it. So remember the only truth that matters here: income is not wealth. Ownership is build it or position yourself where your labor can be translated into it. Everything else is mostly delay, decoration, or confusion. The sooner you understand that, the sooner your effort starts flowing in the right direction. And once effort begins flowing toward ownership, time becomes an ally instead of a spectator. That is where the real freedom begins.